So this presentation is actually, it talks more about replay, which is the lecture capture service, rather than the video capture, but it's a little bit more holistic in that we're discussing here the role of such resources to support student learning overall. And I think one of the things I'd like you to think about during this next session, those thoughts have already been given to us by the keynotes, and indeed if anyone attended the languages workshop this morning, a lot of the ideas from those two sessions will crop up again here. So I'm quite pleased that we've sort of preempted that in some way. I'd like to start off by thinking about what a module life is. And I've just outlined here a typical 10-week module where you've got a series of lectures that are represented here by the little L's. You might have lectures that are sequential, they build upon each other. You might have lectures that are standalone, maybe you're in a team-taught situation where each lecture addresses a specific topic. So how do you have those lectures relating to each other? How do those lectures relate to other scheduled timetable activities, whether that's workshops, labs, seminars? What is the link between those lectures and those activities? And do you have cases where you have a closed loop, so a lecture leads into a workshop which then leads back into a lecture? Do you have that sort of pattern within your module? But underpinning all of that, of course, is the student work. Now, this is a key feature of the York pedagogy, where we're thinking here about the scaffolded and structured approach to student work, linking together all of these different aspects, the lectures, the workshops, and the independent study, and trying to understand the students, the expectations of the students, and how the students will work within each of these contexts. So what I'm going to suggest here is that replay actually has a role to play in all this, and I'll be going on to use another case study from Departments of Psychology and Biology to explain that in a bit more detail. But I'd like to sort of touch upon the limitations of the lecture, not in too much detail, but I think we all recognise that whilst the lecture has some real benefits, there are some constraints upon it. So the lecture doesn't allow students time to process new information. They can't apply it to practice. They can't go and take a theory that they've discovered in a lecture and put it into practice straight away. There's a gap there between the lecture experience and what they're going to do outside the lecture. There's also limited opportunity for discussion, or perhaps even looking on further resources. If you get inspired by something that you've seen in a lecture, where can you go next? Can you find that in the lecture itself? Probably not. You're going to have to think about it, make a note, look it up later on. But I think one of the biggest limitations of the lecture as a concept is that it's a fixed one-time event. It's a one-shot opportunity to get whatever is being presented in that live experience. And that's a shame, really, particularly, as Martin identified, there are cases where the lecture environment may not be conducive to that particular student's mode of learning. There might be other commitments, they might be family commitments, health commitments, all those other commitments that will pull them outside of the lecture environment, and competing workloads. One of the students I've been interviewing really drove home the message about the need to have employability driven into them to the extent that they were sacrificing their academic work in order to make sure they were more employable. And so students are making these trade-offs all the time. So if the lecture is a one-time fixed event, maybe there's some risk there for the students if they're going to miss something essential, particularly if it's key theory that they're going to need to build upon for the rest of their degree. So I'd like to think, though, as the lectures as a positive event. The good thing about lectures is that they can deliver content in a very efficient way, they can inspire, and they can engage individuals. So the idea that what I'm presenting here, if I wrote it down in a textbook, that's going to be less engaging than, I'm hoping anyway, is less engaging than what I'm doing now, trying to talk to you. So how can we take that experience and bring that into students' independent studying outside of the lecture? Well, one of the common ways, I'm sure you'll be aware of, is we provide them with additional resources that they will then use, normally through some sort of structured or scaffolded activity. And that might take place using something like the VLE, where you've got on your VLE module site, you have a list of all your lectures, you have additional resources, but more than just bunging the two together, you point students in the direction of those resources, you provide some sort of activity that goes with it. But do we need to provide that activity all the time, or could we take advantage a little bit more of students' independent learning? The student work that they're doing, they've designed their own activity for, and define their own direction. And essentially that's what we want to get students towards. When they start on the degree course, it's very much directed. The lecture is that directed form of learning. We want to develop their ability to self-direct that learning. So I wanted to unpick that a little bit more. Well, how can we encourage our students to be more self-directed? One of the ways to do this is to think of video as a form of resource. And this model here, presented by Clive Young and Sylvia Mose as part of the Recall project, allows that sort of a framework for us to gauge where the different video resources might be useful. So this framework looks at different forms of learning. This has taken a typical Bloom's taxonomy in the cognitive domain at the bottom there, looking at a very basic level, lower order learning to do with remembering and understanding, and moving through to more higher order learning, creating and evaluating. On the other axis, it's a framework, so it's not a true graph, is learner independence. So what does this actually mean in terms of the tools and what we can provide students? Well, first of all, lecture capture, and I'm sure Jane Grenville probably didn't mean this in a negative way, but lecture capture can provide that means for just memorizing the content. As I go on in a minute, I'm saying there's an alternative there. So lecture capture provided by replay is that the way that we can achieve that. But you can also create your own edited resources, and Martin does this actually on his course, where he uses something like this, which I'm quite pleased I can show you this now. If I switch that over, he will be able to record this on the screen at his desk using a webcam or a visualizer like this, and you can actually walk through drawing a graph and so forth, and that can be captured at your desk using something called personal capture. And that's another piece of software that we support in the Learning Development team, and that's what it looks like. You can also, if we take that from sort of the memorizing and basic understanding, basic knowledge, well, how do we apply that? How can we encourage students to take those resources and apply them to problems? Well, that's where you need to start thinking about how those resources are being used as part of activity. So in lecture capture, the students will see the lecture slides, but they'll incorporate within that private study activity, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But also, if we structure activities using the VLE, that's another way, either before or after the lecture, to engage students with the content, the theoretical content, and then use perhaps the face-to-face time for less of the delivery and more of the applying and analysing that sort of content. And finally, we can go the next step, going right up the higher order level when we're talking about perhaps synchronous video, where we've got Skype calls, or using something like Collaborate, which is the online seminar tool we support, where we're delivering content virtually, but we can also get students to deliver back to us virtually as well. And that's a great mechanism for getting students to do that peer teaching. And if you can't do it synchronously, i.e. facilitated by a lecturer, then you can do it asynchronously by asking students to create their own videos. And we're all part of Google, we can tap into YouTube very easily, and we can secure that down to individual groups if we needed to. So these sorts of tools are all available, and they're all ready to be used, and to support that sort of mix between the face-to-face environment and the independent study. So I'm going to touch upon now lecture capture as one of those types of resources, and this is what the students would see. I'll show you a quick clip of my own recent PGCAP lecture, and it looks like this. The students go in and they access this through the VLE, and you can see you've got an interface that's very simple.
How many of you here have annotated reading lists? On the strength of reading lists, you're able to put in your rationale for including a resource.
So there you are. Hearing me twice in one go, that's enjoyable for you. So that's what lecture capture is. Essentially, there's no video recording, which does have the disadvantage you don't get those sorts of board work, but you can record in some rooms, things like this. But I wanted to sort of address Jane Grenville's comment at the very beginning of today, which was about lecture capture just being for memorising and understanding, and the risk there that students will see lecture recordings as being the definitive thing that students need to learn for their course. Well, isn't that true of all lectures, regardless of whether it's being recorded or not? If you're delivering content, that's what students are going to engage with. And so actually it's about how we set the expectation on how to use the lecture that we need to start to address, which again I'll go on to in a minute. So how can we move the lecture capture from this position of remembering understanding to embedding it within student activity and student work? Well, students are already doing this themselves. They're already doing this as part of their independent study. And so when I spoke to departments of psychology and departments of biology, and I asked them, could I do a research project with you? Because your students have been using lecture capture for several years now. And I was able to have interviews with 15 students, and I got diaries from them as well about how they were using recordings. And these were students who were regularly using lecture capture as part of their studying. And this is something which you think, well, if you're already asking them and they're already using them, well, what can you learn? Well, a lot of the comments that we get from our institutional surveys, and indeed from the national surveys, look a bit like this. It would be nice to have recordings, or recordings are very useful, but that doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us anything about the way that they're using them as part of their studying. So that's why I wanted to approach these particular students. So the questions I was looking at were how the resources and learning activities in class and out of class were being used, not just lecture capture, but their approach to using lecture capture, their expectations about how they would use them, and any changes in study behaviour. And what I like to think about as I go through the results is, well, how can we encourage our own students to perhaps use some of these techniques, or perhaps discourage them from some of the things these students report, to use these recordings in a more effective way. So, the first type of content I was able to get hold of was some diaries. And these diary extracts actually show us the way that lecture captures are being used to go beyond the course. So in this first quote here, this is about how a student has applied what they've taken in the lecture to their workshop. They're actually going back, being able to revisit the content and apply it to a particular problem. The second quote here, very similar to what Martin's found in his project, is about the way that students are unable to keep track in the lecture, and so for their own personal studying they can go back to it, take it at their own pace, have that control about how they use the lecture content. And finally, this third quote is about the way that students are dealing with those competing agendas. They're still attending their lectures, but they're able to participate in other types of recordings. For this example here was a CV workshop. So there's a mix there. If we make perhaps lectures for more modules available to more students and not just those on the module, but there's some interesting possibilities there about how students can expand their knowledge in different areas and then hopefully draw upon them, those mixed areas, in the rest of their work. The interviews I conducted here, the quotes I have here from the first set of interviews that I did in the autumn term, and again, we're talking here about less pressure within the lecture, the ability to stay focused in the lecture. But what I found more interesting is the way they're using their lecture recordings as part of their independent study. So these particular students are very keen, I think it's fair to say. These particular students really want to do well, and they were using the recordings to actually replay the lecture from start to end again. This one particular student had a set of notes he took in the lecture, a set of notes he took when watching the lecture recording, and he compared the two, so that he came up with a very coherent set of notes at the end of the day. I also found this quote very interesting, where students are saying, well, I recognise that after the lecture I might go, yeah, I get that concept, yeah, I understand that, but 3 months down the line when they're doing the exam, what they thought they knew, they suddenly realise they don't. And so they're able to structure their independent study by revisiting the lecture 3 weeks down the line, 9 weeks down the line, and then prior to revision, the revision prior to the exam. So they're actually able to draw upon the resource at various points in their whole module. The students are aware of that, and they're actually starting to think about how they're using these resources, these lecture recordings, in the session itself. So as they're sitting here making notes, if they identify at that point, I'm not going to get this just doesn't make any sense to me, and putting a little mark on their notes and saying, I'm going to watch this again later. And again, that seems to suggest that their study behaviour and their study practice is starting to change. That link between the face-to-face environment and what happens afterwards is becoming stronger. But this was the critique. This was the bit that Jane Grenville picked up on. Well, aren't they just going to use the lecture recording as the definitive tome of knowledge for that subject? Well, probably yes. If the assessment is geared up for that sort of behaviour, then probably yes. But similarly, the students are here, they come and attend lectures because they want the expertise of the lecturer. So why not enable them to have that opportunity again and again? Why not enable them to revisit that expertise so they can draw upon it just like a textbook, so they can draw upon it from a different perspective? There were some key themes that emerged. Students think about how they're going to use the recordings during the live lecture. They use them in addition to their other resources, their textbooks, their own notes, which are the most valuable resource they have to hand. And it does start to become part of their overall study approach. They will use the recordings to scaffold their independent learning. So we're bridging that gap there between what happens in the face-to-face and what happens in the outside environment simply by providing this type of resource. But the question I have for you, and I'd like you to spend a few minutes thinking about, and please feel free, if you have a mobile device, I see only one or two in the room, to log on to that web link there and answer that question. How could we support students' use of lecture content in their independent study? So based upon everything I've just explained, what approaches would you tell your students in the first lecture of the first term of the first year? How would you encourage them to use what you're going to do here in their own independent study? Anyway, I just want to wrap up. The final question I was going to pose to you is a little bit more provocative, which was, if you were going to avoid using the lecture as knowledge transfer, what would you use that face-to-face time for? Because you could, of course, create videos in advance in the flipped classroom model, and that's a whole other lecture that I could give. So I won't go down that route, but that's a more provocative question for you to think about is, well, am I using this face-to-face contact time the most effectively? Now we have other types of resources that we could utilize. So just to conclude, there is a relationship between the lectures and students' independent study practice. Certainly that's what I seem to be finding from this research with those two departments. And I think that when you've got a very careful design, particularly in the case where, I mean, Martin's is a good case where the pace of the course alone requires the students to be able to make sure they understand each of those lectures in turn. When you have that design, you really need to think about the way that activity and resource provision supports student work overall.